Well, good morning, everybody. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and today we are beginning the Martin Luther King series. It will be a six-part series, and it's very timely. The reason I chose to do RFK and MLK back to back at this time is because the files were released. In fact, just yesterday, the RFK files came out, and I noticed that the resident spokesperson for all the lone gunmen in the world has already come out on X and voiced his support yet again, for the government's position that RFK was killed by Sirhan, just like he has made a living off of his support for the lone gunman theory out of Dallas. And he's also written a book supporting the lone gunman narrative regarding the assassination in Memphis and Martin Luther King. And of course, his name is Gerald Posner. So he was all over X last night talking about that. Just finished the RFK series and hopefully made a case for what I think happened, which is that the CIA, by infiltrating RFK's security detail with Thane Eugene Caesar, killed him. And it has many motives, primarily because he was going to reopen the case about his brother's assassination, but also because he was not going to support a war in Vietnam or continue the war in Vietnam. And there may be other motives as well, which is why they threw the Palestinian patsy out there, because there's some motives regarding the United States and Israel during this period of time as well. So, but I think it's pretty clear that the agency is responsible for both Kennedy's deaths. Today, we're going to talk about another intelligence. Now, today and the next 5 episodes, we're going to be talking about another intelligence killing in the 60s. I hope I didn't just spoil it by telling you what I think, but I'm going to make the case. I think everyone pretty much is familiar with what the government said happened, and we'll review that, go over the evidence, and but then we'll get into what we didn't learn in history class. So that is where we are headed. And, I had made mention when I was talking about RFK that the agency, and I went through a timeline of the CIA's involvement in domestic issues with respect to especially civil rights and most especially with the anti-war movement, and how Operation Chaos was the CIA's domestic operation to discredit those movements and portray them as violent to the American people and undercut their support, their fundraising, et cetera, and in doing so, discredit the leadership. So Operation Chaos was how RFK was killed. The FBI's version of Operation Chaos was something called COINTELPRO. And so we'll be talking about the FBI's version of domestic spying, surveillance, and infiltration. And I use the word rat fucking. It just seems to better describe what these things are all about. So that's where we're going with this. The FBI and its COINTEL program, which is the equivalent of the CIA and its Operation Chaos program. They won't use all the same tactics or means. Remember, in the CIA, they used things like hypnosis and LSD, and it got pretty scientific. It was based on a lot of research the Germans gave us after World War II when they brought a bunch of their scientists back to America. They taught us how to use hypnosis. They taught us how to use drugs. They taught us how to torture. They taught us how to use truth serums. They taught us how to, basically taught us everything we know. And then when we ran out of foreign subjects on whom we could test that, Korean War, Vietnam War, people on the Far East, East Asia, et cetera, we began testing all these things on our own people. We talked about MK Ultra and all that. So the FBI will not use the same tactics, but the objectives are the same, virtually identical. So I want to go over some sources first, so you know, if you want to continue this research on your own, you can look into some of these sources, and I'm sure there's others as well, but these are some that I've drawn from. Obviously, there are government investigations into the assassination of Martin Luther King. There was the FBI investigation right on the heels of his assassination. But then in the late 70s, the House Select Committee reopened the investigation into all the assassinations of that period, including Martin Luther King. And there's a lot of records available just to kind of give you the basic structure of what the government said happened. So a lot of my baseline comes from what I learned from these documents. Come from they're under the umbrella of the JFK assassination records, but they have different categories within that on RFK and MLK, et cetera, et cetera. So today we'll be looking at a lot of the information from this particular set of records, just to give you the outline, the overview of the case itself, the trial, et cetera, what the government's evidence was, what the evidence was that was published out to the American people. A lot of it will come from this source here. Another source, and this is somebody that I think you cannot overstate the importance of Dr. William Pepper and his contributions to Martin Luther King research, also RFK research, because he got involved in that as well, which is why I listed him as a source in my RFK series as well. He's best known for his defense of James Earl Ray. He was an attorney. He was a writer for a while, then he was an attorney. And after a period of convincing or research where he was convinced that Sirhan was innocent of the charge, I'm sorry, not James Sirhan, but James Earl Ray, that he was innocent of having killed MLK, he agreed to represent him. And it's interesting, he has the unique distinction of also being a friend of the victim. He was, in the last year of Martin Luther King's life, he was a very close confidant of Martin Luther King and his family, and as such, represented the Martin Luther King family as they went forward all the way up to 1999, when the King family sued the city of Memphis and the government for wrongful death, believing that they could prove by that point, the evidence would prove by that point, all indications were that the government conspired with other actors to kill Martin Luther King. And so they sued in 1999, and their lead attorney was Dr. William Pepper, who simultaneously was also representing, up to the time he died in 98, but he was also representing the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator, the antagonist, right? James Earl Ray. So go find me another attorney out there who represents both the victims and the perpetrator in the same case. It just doesn't happen. But what the interests began to merge at some point. Martin Luther King family began to learn the truth about what happened to Martin, MLK, and the fact that he was not killed by James Earl Ray. All of a sudden, in order to prove their case, they had to help James Earl Ray prove his case. And it just made sense to hire the same attorney. So he's written 3 books. Yeah, of course, he's not alive anymore, but there are plenty of opportunities if you want to hear him speak on YouTube. And of course, you can read his books. The latest book, The Plot to Kill King, is sort of a summation of everything. And it's unbelievably researched, sourced, everything. So he is a very key source in all of this. Another source is Judge Joe Brown. He is the last judge to preside over James Earl Ray's appeal process. He, in the process, this was over several years, as he oversaw this case, he became convinced that James Earl Ray was innocent. And every time the government would try to, he was pushing the government a little bit. There's no question. He was pushing the government to do things that it had not been required to do in the first trials or the appeals process up to this point, because he believed the government had gotten away with something and they had been protected by friendly judges, media coverage, et cetera, et cetera. So he began, judges are supposed to be impartial. And the government felt for the first time in this legal matter that they were on the defensive and they didn't like it. And so they shopped around and found a judge, and who eventually got Judge Joe Brown thrown off the case because they charged him with alleged bias. If you read the ruling, the reason he's thrown off the case is because he's giving, in their view, false hope to the defendant, James Earl Ray, that he's going to get a new trial. They didn't even want a new trial. Forget that he might rule in their favor, in Earl Ray's favor, in the trial. Ultimately, they don't even want him to have a new trial. So they threw him off the case. Again, Judge Joe Brown, kind of a colorful figure. He was a pretty prominent person around Memphis. He was an attorney there. Then he was a judge. He ran for mayor, I think, once or twice. He had his own talk show on television. It was called Judge Joe Brown. But anyway, he's got a lot to say about Martin Luther King and his death. And he's really considered to be, Dr. Pepper considers him to be an expert when it came to the ballistics part of it. And it was Judge Joe Brown's work regarding ballistics that helped prove that it couldn't have been, it literally could not have been James Earl Ray's rifle that killed Martin Luther King. So a lot of my ballistics information comes from Judge Joe Brown. You have these two books here, one by Mark Lane, Dick Gregory. Interesting, Mark Lane was James Earl Ray's first attorney. He had intimate knowledge of this case. Dick Gregory was the civil rights activist. He also was on television and things of that nature, who grilled the one famous interchange. He grilled one of the ministers, Reverend Billy Kyles, who was from Memphis and who was with Martin Luther King the day he died. In fact, they were all headed to his house to eat dinner that night. They stepped out onto the balcony. And he suspected that somebody on the inside had infiltrated Martin Luther King's inner circle and set him up and made a deal with the government to set him up. He suspected it was Reverend Billy Kyles, and we'll get to that, but there's a famous interview where Dick Gregory challenges Reverend Billy Kyles, who made a whole life time. Became what he was known for, of being a civil rights icon who was with Martin Luther King the day he died. So he took with him that, he sort of grabbed that mantle and ran with it afterwards. Dick Gregory thought he was a fraud. Dick Gregory thought, you're the guy that set him up. And he got in his face, got some interesting words out of Billy Kyle. We'll talk about that at some point. But of course, we're going to talk a lot about J. Edgar Hoover and his running war with Martin Luther King. He just could not stand Martin Luther King. It was personal, J. Edgar Hoover. So David Garrow's written a good book about the FBI and its single-minded focus as a result of J. Edgar Hoover's single-minded focus. He was the director of the FBI. So he set the agenda. And the lengths to which J. Edgar Hoover would go to set this whole thing up in motion. It's pretty amazing. You know, when you study these conspiracies, these plots, it's pretty amazing the setup and the lead up, the cover stories, all the work that goes into creating a conspiracy that when it's all said and done, the conspirators themselves walk away blameless. And some poor unwitting patsy ends up taking the blame for everything and convincing all of the world, American people, that that's exactly what happened. It doesn't happen in a single afternoon or a week or a day or a month or even a year. It takes years to set these things up. And so we've seen that in the JFK case. And I think we saw it to a lesser degree in the RFK case, but we're going to see it again here with the FBI in the Martin Luther King case. Another source, interesting source. If you'd asked me, I would ever use Jesse Jackson as a source of any of the research projects, I probably said no, but here we are. I was listening to a podcast with him recently, and he went back to the scene. It's in-depth RAM. You see the picture at the top right there. That was it's on YouTube. That was the podcast. And it was a kind of a somber look back in history of what happened on that day. Of course, they're standing at the Lorraine Hotel on the balcony where the shooting happened. And you see that middle picture there. Jesse Jackson was standing out there with Martin Luther King. So he was right there when it happened. And of course, he's got some strong feelings about what he thinks happened. He knew from being on the inside that Martin Luther King was under almost unceasing attack by our government, by the media. And he does not believe the government story. He does not believe James Earl Ray killed him. He believes that it was the government. And so I got a little anecdotal information from Jesse Jackson himself. All right, what I want to do is start off with the narrative that we've all been taught. As a history teacher myself, I've taught this. I'm a little ashamed to say, that through the years, when we reached the assassination of Martin Luther King, it was kind of interesting, the way the textbooks approach this topic is a lot of times textbooks are arranged chronologically. So you get into the 60s and you end up having to talk about some of these assassinations. But then they also present some material topically. And the civil rights movement most times gets its own chapter, its own unit. And so then at some point you're dealing with the assassination in the civil rights unit as well. So you're talking about it twice, a lot of times. And at different points, not even at the same point, but at different points. And the story is always the same, right? You had this Southern redneck guy. He was a career petty criminal. His name was James Earl Ray. And of course, right off the bat, to establish a motive, the government told us that he was a known racist. So if they can't come up with any other motive, that's enough, right? He was a racist, so he killed a black guy. He was already in prison, or he had been in prison several times. He was supposed to be in prison at the time that this assassination happened. He was serving a 20-year sentence for being a repeat offender. He had armed with a gun, armed robbery, from a Kroger store in St. Louis and stole $120 in 1959. So when he got before the judge looked at his record and said, well, you're a repeat offender. Normally, I wouldn't give you 20 years for this particular crime, but because you're a repeat offender, I'm going to send you to the Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City. Now, this was a notorious prison. Supposed to be, they said it was the bloodiest 47 acres. Time magazine said it was the bloodiest 47 acres in America. It was a old, decrepit, rundown prison with a lot of the worst offenders in it. And James Earl Ray was sent there. And this was in 1959. In 67, so about 8 years later, he escapes from the Missouri State Penitentiary, hid in the back of a bread truck the next time we see him, he's an ex-con now, out on the lam. He's a runaway, so he's got a obviously everybody's looking for him. He ends up in Memphis, Tennessee, in April of '68, 1 year later, and he ends up in a flop house or a rooming house rented directly across from the Lorraine Motel. And on April 4th, he opened fire. Actually, only shot one shot, but he killed Martin Luther King as he was standing on the balcony in front of his room at the Lorraine Hotel. And so that's the story that we get about James Earl Ray, career criminal, serving a 20-year term, escapes. We don't know where he is. He's in the wind, ends up in Memphis, Tennessee, of all places, and shoots and kills the preeminent civil rights leader of our time, or probably of our history. Why? Because he's a racist. That's the story that we got from the government. This is I thought I'd include this. This is a drawing by James Earl Ray. As you can see, he has signed it, of the Jefferson City prison. And it's just kind of interesting sometimes to see who these people are. He had a lot of spare time on his hands at this prison, obviously. And so he did. If you can get online and you can find a lot of his drawings. So evidently this was a hobby of his. So anyway, he escaped from that facility in a bread truck. He folded himself into a very small space, hid himself in this bread truck. So then after the shooting of Martin Luther King, he flees the scene. He goes to Atlanta, and then he goes across the border into Canada, up to Toronto. Eventually, he gets a passport, goes to England, where he's captured in London. And then he fights extradition, but he loses. He ends up being tried back in Memphis for Martin Luther King's murder and received a 99-year prison sentence, after which all of his appeals were denied. In '97, fast forwarding about 30 years, the state of Tennessee denied Ray's request to leave Tennessee and go to Pittsburgh. He had a liver problem, and the only way to save his life was to get a liver transplant. The state of Tennessee denied him travel privileges, and a year later, he dies of liver failure in a Tennessee prison. And that's the story that we've all been taught about the assassination of Martin Luther King. It was a racial issue by this ne'er-do-well career criminal, kind of this no-count guy who the only reason he was able to commit the crime was because he had escaped a 20-year term in Missouri. Wanted to show you the crime scene so you kind of get a lay of the land, how it looks. This is obviously an aerial view. And Mulberry Street is the one you want to focus on, right there in the middle. Because on the upper part of that, above Mulberry Street, is Lorraine Motel. It's a motel, not a hotel. I've put a red circle there. That's the room 306 where Martin Luther King was assassinated, out on that balcony. So just so you kind of see where that is. Now, if you go down below Mulberry Street, there are some circles there I want you to notice. On the right, there is a fire station. And that fire station, in that red circle, we're going to find out there were some people placed on the roof of that building and also inside that building looking out a window. And you can see this is a very close 50 yards. I've been there. It's just like Dealey Plaza in the sense that it's smaller than you think. You know, when you get to Dealey Plaza and you look through, or you stand behind the stockade fence on the grassy knoll, and you look down at the X, the spot on the pavement where President Kennedy was shot in the head, even without a scope, it's an easy shot because it's so close. You put a scope on it, it'd be like a turkey shoot. Same thing here. It's very close. And then you have a second circle there right directly in front. Martin Luther King's room on below Mulberry Street, and that is the bush line from which there was a shooter and a spotter identified aiming his rifle at Martin Luther King from in those bushes. And you can see how close that is. And it's a head-on shot, straight ahead. All right. Then you have the yellow circle there, which is where the government said James Earl Ray was, the rooming house bathroom window there. And that's where they said the shots came from. And that's where James Earl Ray was. And then you have at the very bottom on Main Street there, this was where the government said James Earl Ray ran out the front of the rooming house out onto Main Street and ditched a bundle. He panicked and he ditched a bundle in the store window area of a neighboring business there called Knipes. And that's where the police found the gun and binoculars, and radio, his name on the radio, so they knew who they were looking for, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted you to get a look at the layout there. And before we proceed any further, that bush line there, the city will come the next day and take out all those bushes. There's also in front of the window there, the bathroom window of the rooming house, the yellow circle there, a tree line, and they will cut those trees as well. And I just wanted to plant that seed in your head because that becomes a real problem for the government trying to show that James Earl Ray could have made that shot from the bathroom window when there was a tree limb in the way. Now the problem goes away if the city comes in the next day and cuts the tree down. And then when evidence starts to emerge, people start to say they saw folks behind the bushes. They saw somebody with a rifle behind the bushes, and they saw someone flee the scene from behind the bushes. All of a sudden, the bushes become a problem. Well, the problem goes away if you just go and you completely take out all the bushes. And so the bushes disappeared. And of course, to this day, you don't hear any mention by anybody about the fire station. So it's always about James Earl Ray and that bathroom window in the rooming house. And before we proceed with this, just remember, one of the tricks of intelligence always is to use diversion to get you thinking the shooting is coming from one place when it's actually coming from another. You get all the attention focused on the left hand and miss what the right hand is doing. Also, another trick of intelligence is always to set up a patsy in advance. Some poor ne'er-do-well who can take the blame, and it serves as another diversion to everyone who is bloodthirsty for answers to what just happened, and they want somebody to pay. The government is right there ready to offer up on a platter somebody who can pay. And so these are just a couple things to keep in mind as we proceed through this. All right. So you start with the physical evidence. That's where I usually like to start. And fortunately, in this case, we have an autopsy report that's credible. JFK's case, we didn't. RFK, the autopsy blew a hole in the government story, so they had to completely suppress it during the trial. And here we're going to have another autopsy, which is going to, well, I'll let you make up your own mind. According to the autopsy, Martin Luther King was killed by one shot fired from directly in front of him. Okay, one shot. And according to the autopsy, it says a single gunshot wound to the chin and neck with a total transaction of the lower cervical and upper thoracic spinal cord and other structures of the neck. It was a cataclysmic shot. Interestingly, it didn't just enter his body one time. On close examination, this single bullet entered the right side of his face, right below the mouth, so down here in the jaw area, fractured his jaw, and it exited the lower part of his face. So if you look back at this picture, you can kind of see what they're saying here. Enter, exit, entry, exit. But then it re-enters. After it exits the lower part of his face, it re-enters the body down in the neck area. And there's where it caught, he probably would have lived if it just hits the jaw, destroys the jaw area. But then it gets into the neck and it starts bouncing around in there, and it severed numerous arteries. And this is why the blood was to the extent that it was. Fractured the spine. If he had lived, he would have been a paraplegic. Caused severe damage to the spinal column, and it rested on the left side of the back. And throughout this entire journey of this bullet, it traveled in a downward trajectory. And when they pulled the slug from Martin Luther King's body, they found that it was a Remington Peters soft point metal jacketed bullet fired from distance by a high velocity rifle. Right? So key there was a metal jacketed bullet, which full metal jacket means it doesn't explode on contact. Remember the parallels to the JFK cases. The one shot that hit him in the head was a frangible bullet, exploding bullet. All the other bullets hit JFK were full metal jackets, indicating at least 2 rifles. Well, here you have only 1 shot. So it can only be 1 rifle. It was a full metal jacket. All right, this picture here is of the hotel, the motel, and you can see the room number there that Martin Luther King was in. That was the door. And when he came out into the balcony overlooking the parking area below, where you see the walls there, and then you see Mulberry Street right there between those 2 walls. But if you were standing in the same place that Martin Luther King was standing when he was shot, then this is the view that you would have if you were looking straight out in front of you. And those are the buildings. Now, I want you to notice the bushes. That is a rat's nest of bushes. This is how it looked moments after. These are photos of the crime scene. So this is how it looked before the city went in there and trimmed out all those bushes. So, and then of course the window from which the government is going to say the fatal shot is completely obscured. You can't even see it. I know where it's at because I know if you look at that telephone pole there, well, it's behind that telephone pole. You can kind of see it peeking out from behind it, but it's behind that telephone pole. And you can see there's a tree line there and these bushes, and they don't even look like bushes. It looks like some ratty mess is what it looks like, but they were bushes. They called them bushes. The precise directional and trajectory data could not be determined primarily because a dissection of the bullet's path was not performed during the autopsy, which was a mistake. Okay, I want to point that out. Normally, you dissect the bullet's path in the victim's body, so it shows you from where this bullet was fired. This was not performed. So all of the information that we have going forward about where this bullet was fired, is circumstantial and anecdotal. It's not current physical evidence at all. It's I saw this, I heard that. It's testimony from people is what it is. It's what they thought they heard, things of that nature. But that is a serious flaw in the autopsy, not to have dissected the path of the bullet. They didn't do it. But from what the witnesses who were there on the scene saw and heard. And from what you could observe just by looking at the damaged Martin Luther King's face, most people believed that the shot had come from his right and above. And if you look straight out here, you're looking straight at the bushes. But to his right, and a little bit above, it's just interesting. If you go to Memphis and you go to the scene, one of the first things you notice is the Lorraine Motel sits down in kind of like a valley. It's in a depression, and the street in front is raised, so everything's uphill from the Lorraine. And then you got that big retaining wall there holding up the bushes and the ground above. And then you have those buildings on top of the ground looking down on the Lorraine. And so this is the impression that most people had that were on the scene at that moment, that the shooting came from one of those buildings, one of those windows on one of those buildings. As they looked down on, and of course the bullet had a downward trajectory. So it just made sense that it was someone shot at him from above, to his right, because it injured the right side of his face, entered the right side of his face, which makes sense, right? It's just unfortunate that the autopsy did not do a dissection of the bullet path. Let's talk about some of the witnesses on the scene on that day. Charles Stevens, pictured here in the red circle, was staying in this rooming house. He was a tenant. He occupied room 6B. That's a pivotal location, as you'll find out as we go forward. And he maintained in a sworn affidavit that on 2 or 3 occasions during the afternoon of April 4th, the day in question, he, quote, heard footsteps leaving room 5B. 5B is where they're going to say James Earl Ray was. And of course, that was the room that he rented. And that's where they said the shots came from. So he's talking about 5B. Of course, he's 6B. So he's one room over. And he says he heard footsteps leaving 5B, going past his room and into the common bathroom at the end of the hall. So he's, whatever he's doing, sitting there. We find out later, we know exactly what he's doing when we get to the taxi driver. But he tells authorities that he heard somebody from 5B going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth from his room to the bathroom. So what we learned first is there's not a bathroom in each room. There is a common bathroom at the end of the hall that they all share. And this is the bathroom from which the authorities are going to say James Earl Ray fired the shot that killed Martin Luther King. Charles Stevens' testimony is important because it shows that whoever was in 5B, which we know was, it appears, was James Earl Ray, because he's the one who rented the room, was back and forth into that bathroom several times on the day of the shooting. Another tenant, William Anschutz, told FBI that on the afternoon of April 4th, he tried to use the bathroom 2 times, and both times he came, he found it occupied. And he said that Stevens told him through his door. In other words, Stevens didn't open the door and talk to him. He just yelled out through his door to Anschutz that the bathroom was being used by whoever was staying in 5B. So his bathroom is a matter of concern here, because the authorities are saying this is where the shots came from. So they want to know who was in that bathroom. And these 2 tenants, neither one saw James Earl Ray in that bathroom, but according to Stevens, he heard whoever was in 5B going back and forth to that bathroom. Never saw him, but he heard him. And then, according to Anschutz, the bathroom was locked. He couldn't get in. And when he went back, found it to be locked again. Stevens, the same guy who said it was the guy in 5B, yelled out to him and said it was the guy in 5B. So, but again, neither one of them have seen James Earl Ray in that bathroom. And Anschutz is only reporting what Stevens told him. So Stevens is the key witness here. Neither one of these guys could recall details of these bathroom visits by the occupant because they didn't see him. But Stevens said in a sworn statement that at the time of the assassination, he was sitting at his kitchen table, again in 6B, and he heard a loud explosion that he recognized immediately as a shot. And after he looked out the window toward the Lorraine Motel, he said he heard footsteps again running in the hall. This guy, he's always hearing things. So he went to the door, he opened it, and he looked out and he observed a man with his back to him, running with something under his arm, turning the corner at the end of the hallway. He didn't see his face. He just said, I saw somebody running with something under his arm, and it was right after the explosion, right after the shot. And when they asked Stevens, he said he was sure that the individual had come from the bathroom adjoining his apartment because of the loudness of the shot, because evidently the bathroom at the end of the hallway was next to his room. And the sound was so loud, he felt sure that's where the shot came from. And then when he opened the door, he saw somebody running with something under his arm. And of course, what he did at that point is he put two and two together, right? We would all do that. Whoever was in 5B kept going back and forth to that bathroom. So much that when Anschutz tried to go to the bathroom, it was locked twice. So he told him, hey, it's the guy in 5B. Then he hears the shot. He opens the door, looks out, sees somebody running away from the bathroom. So he puts two and two. And he says, well, it's the guy that's been using the bathroom all morning. And so this is what he tells authorities. There's that famous picture. This is one of the reasons why the narrative quickly became what it became, which is that all the shots came from, or the shot came from above and to the right. Because the famous photograph shows the people, as you see King lying there, he's shot, he's dying. But here they are pointing in the direction of the rooming house, saying that's where the shot came from. They pointed in the direction of the rear of the rooming house when they were asked by a police officer, what was the direction of the shot? They all pointed in the same direction. So again, none of this is physical evidence, but it makes sense, does it not? Martin Luther King was shot on the right side of his face and his jaw. He was standing there face in front towards the bushes, towards the street. The building, the flop house, was to his right and above. So it makes sense for them to say that's where the shot came from. They don't know about the bathroom. They don't know about whether it's a rooming house and what window, and they're just pointing in that general direction. But when they go in to interview the tenants of that rooming house, they're getting a story here that's painting a picture that somebody in 5B was acting very suspicious and was using that bathroom. And so when they went and they looked out the bathroom window, and it looks right out over the crime scene, again, now you have officers doing what Anschutz and Stevens did. They're putting two and two together, right? And all evidence seems to point in that direction. Merrill McCullough, who we're going to talk more about Merrill McCullough later, he's the guy kneeling over Martin Luther King. He's one of the first on the scene, but you can see he's attending to Martin Luther King somewhat. But he's mostly looking up in the direction where he thinks the shots came from, where the other witnesses are pointing in that direction. This guy happens to be an undercover Memphis police officer. He's one of the first to reach Dr. King's body. He testified based on his expertise that he determined from the position of the fallen body, where the shot hit the King, etc., that the shot had come from the area of the rooming house. All right, so here you have, it's one thing to have tenants in a rooming house saying they heard this, they saw that. It's another thing to have these witnesses pointing in that direction saying we think the shots came from. It's another thing altogether. Imagine you're a Memphis police detective and you're investigating. You're one of the first on the scene. You're talking to one of yours, right? He's been trained. He's got expertise in these matters, and he tells you, hey, the shots came from above and to the right. And that's the rooming house. So the evidence is pretty strong, at least based on the witnesses, what they saw, what they heard, that the shots came from the rooming house. Ben Branch and Jesse Jackson, both, again, as I mentioned, both with, as I mentioned earlier about Jesse Jackson, you can see in that picture, I've got a circle there, the red circle, that's Jesse Jackson. So he's standing to Martin Luther King's right in that particular photograph. And he's there on the scene when Martin Luther King gets shot. Ben Branch, I pictured on the top photo in the red circle there, another confidant of Martin Luther King on the scene that day. And they both said the same thing, that they believed that the shot had come from the direction of the rooming house. This is their first testimony in the aftermath. So they go to the rooming house, they talk to the tenants, they go, and now they're looking at the bathroom, right? And here's what they find. There was a slight indentation on the, first of all, they found this window, this bathroom window, cracked open, as you can see. They left it. To this day, if you go visit, they've left it like this. So you can imagine how the crime took place, if you believe their narrative. And as they're examining the windowsill, they found a slight indentation in that windowsill in the bathroom. And it was speculated by a Memphis police officer that was caused by a rifle barrel, resting a heavy rifle, waiting for your opportunity to shoot. It's left a small indentation. There's no way to prove it, but that was the speculation. They also discovered that there was a bathtub, as you can see in the bottom picture, square right in front of the window, indicating that really the only way you could take that shot is to stand in the bathtub. And they found scuff marks in this bathtub that they speculated were from the assassin's shoes. Now, by the time they found these scuff marks, the police had been in and around in that bathtub as well. So it could have been scuff marks from the policeman, his shoes, as he was looking through that window. He got in the bathtub as well. But anyway, they did find scuff marks in the bathtub, and they were looking through that bathroom window. And of course, what was reported was that there was a clear shot at room 306 of the Lorraine. And the only way that clear shot is possible is if you stand in that bathtub. Now, I want to go back, just remind you of this picture. This is the crime scene after the shooting, before they had time to think, that window is obscured by all these bushes and these trees. We need to get rid of these bushes and these trees. This is how it looked. Okay. And kind of reminds me of Dallas. Remember, everybody said Lee Harvey Oswald fired from the sixth floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. A little small problem with that was the Texas live oaks that were lining Elm Street there. They're still there, by the way, but they keep them trimmed. But in the aftermath of the shooting, of course, this is November, and they don't lose their leaves until the spring. These trees were, at full bloom, so to speak. And they were big, tall trees that presented an obstacle, especially to the fatal shot from that window and that view. There was a problem. Oswald had to, if it was Oswald, he had to sort of guess where the target was going to be. Well, we have the same problem here until Memphis, the city of Memphis, clears it all out the next day. Okay. The conclusion, that the investigators reached, FBI, was that although the scientific evidence did not independently establish the location of the assassin, and by that I mean the physical evidence, the scientific evidence that is irrefutable. They didn't have any of that. It's just he said, she said. I heard, you heard, kind of a thing. It did not independently establish the location of the assassin. When you combine it with the corroborated testimony of Stevens and Anschutz and the absence of any significant evidence of an alternative firing location, the conclusion was that the shot that killed MLK was fired from the bathroom window at the rear of the rooming house at 422 and a half South Main Street. By the way, this is another crime scene photo of the view out that bathroom window at room 306 when you're looking above. If you're this is you're looking, the black part at the bottom is the windowsill. So if you sit your gun on that and put it through the opening, this is the view that you have. So I wanted to include that as well. And you can see room 306 there is, again, behind that telephone pole. So you got a little bit of an obstruction there. And so anyway, that's I've given you the view now from both directions. The view from this direction is much better than the view from the Lorraine looking back at the rooming house, clearly. But you still got that telephone pole and such. So that's the conclusion that was reached. Here is another view. I've circled the window. So you can see here that shot could be, it is credible. It is credible, even with the bushes and even with the trees and the limbs and things, you still could conceivably make that shot. And that is the direction that everyone's pointing after the shot is taken. And then you got the testimony of Anschutz and Stevens, and you've got the open window, and somebody from 5B was spent a lot of time in that bathroom. And then, according to Stevens, they ran out after the shot was taken. And then pretty quickly after, they're going to find this bundle with a bunch of incriminating materials in it. And it's going to look pretty open and shut, is my point. Pretty open and shut. This is the inside of 5B. This is the room James Earl Ray rented. This is the pretty small little rooming house there. Ray, when he was eventually arrested 2 months later, did admit to renting room 5B at the rooming house. In fact, according to her recollection, when she showed him a room, he rejected the first selection. And so she finally offered him 5B and he accepted it. And of course, 5B was different from the first choice because 5B had a view overlooking the Lorraine Motel out that window. Now, according to the government, the shot came from the bathroom window. So it's not like he needed that window to take the shot, but it did offer a view of the Lorraine Motel. And the other room that she offered first did not. Some more physical evidence. We're going back to that bundle that Stevens said he saw somebody running down, all he saw is him from behind. He was carrying a bundle. And when they asked him, well, what did you see in that bundle? Was there anything in there that stuck out? I mean, could you see anything? Both Stevens said, well, it could have had a rifle in it, but I couldn't tell for sure. He was fleeing down the hallway shortly after the shooting. Well, they didn't have to speculate for long because not that long later, Memphis police officers found in front of Knipes a bundle. And in that bundle, as you can see the picture down below, that's what they found. They found 2 cans of Schlitz beer. They found an April 18th edition of the Memphis newspaper, the Commercial Appeal, opened to a story about Martin Luther King, his Memphis trip, staying at the Lorraine Hotel, et cetera, et cetera. They found a plastic bottle of aftershave lotion. They found a .30-06 rifle with a serial number matching that of the rifle that they later determined Ray had purchased this rifle in Birmingham, Alabama, about a week or so earlier. So the rifle has the serial number that matches a rifle that they know now their suspect bought a week or so earlier in Birmingham. There was ammunition in the bundle. There were binoculars in the bundle. There was also a radio that we'll get to in just a minute, which was extremely incriminating, you'll find out. Back to the rifle. Ray had purchased this rifle. It was a Remington Game Master with a slide action rifle. It had the serial number 461476. It was a model 760. It had a Redfield scope. And its serial number was A17350. And it had a Weaver sight mount. And he purchased all this on March 30th, 1968 in Birmingham. The rifle, the sight, and the mount were the exact same ones they found in the bundle. So now they have what they think is the murder weapon, and they have a suspect because they know who bought it. When they finally arrest Ray, he admitted that on March 29th, the day before the purchase of this Remington Game Master, he'd actually bought a .243 caliber rifle and a telescopic sight in Birmingham, but acting on instructions, and that's key, he went back the next day and traded it in. So the brand new .243 that he'd bought the day before, he trades in the next day for a more powerful .30-06 Remington Game Master. And that's how we get the two-gun purchase on 2 different days, the 29th and 30th. It resulted really in one purchase because it was a trade. That rifle was identified as the rifle found in front of Knipes on April 4th. So here you have, just like the Oswald rifle, you have direct physical evidence that the gun that belonged to James Earl Ray, the suspect that after 2 months they'll finally get in custody after he tried to flee the scene, it was his gun they found in this bundle right outside the rooming house where he admitted he rented a room. So then in the rooming house itself, they find an empty bullet cartridge, which later proved to be from the bullet. They pulled that out of Martin Luther King. It came from this cartridge. And of course, this cartridge came from his gun. So then they start doing fingerprints. They find latent fingerprints on the rifle, on the binoculars, on the Schlitz beer can, and on the front page of the Memphis newspaper. And they were all belonging to the same person, James Earl Ray. All right. This radio that was in this bundle had an ID number on it. And it was partially scratched off. When they were finally the FBI was finally able to decipher the number, turned out to be Ray's penitentiary number when he was a prisoner at Missouri State Pen, Jefferson City. So, my goodness, it looks like an open and shut case, doesn't it? You've got Ray admitting to renting the room. You've got witnesses saying Ray was beating a path back and forth from his room to the bathroom in the hall. You have all the witnesses on the ground saying the fatal shot came from the bathroom window in the rooming house. And of course, that's where Ray was. Then you have a witness who says after the shot, they saw the outline of a man running with a bundle. They find the bundle. It's got all this information. It's got fingerprints that tie back to Ray. It's got a gun that ties back to Ray. It's got a radio that ties back to Ray. Everything ties back to Ray. And then when they look and they find the shell casing, it ties back to the bullet that they found in the bundle that belongs the rifle in that bundle was Ray's, so the shell casing must be from Ray. And the bullet that they pull out of Martin Luther King matches the shell casing, which matches the rifle. It all ties back to Ray. Then you have the anecdotal information, right? The fact that he fled the scene. Who flees the scene if you don't have anything to hide? Most people take that as an admission of guilt. Then, come trial, he plea bargains. And in order to escape the death penalty, he takes a 99-year sentence cops of police, says he's guilty, pleads guilty, and then spends the rest of his life fighting it, trying to get a new trial. But in that moment, when he had a chance to fight for his innocence, he pled guilty. um, by the way, that picture here, I wanted to include that because it includes his alias. And you can look underneath there and you see that he's got several aliases. The first one is Eric Galt, Eric S. Galt, and then he's got others there. Uh, when they compared fingerprints found in the rooming house to known fugitives, the FBI, he's been in the system forever. They found that the fingerprints matched James Earl Ray. So the wanted poster goes out, including his mug shots from his time at Jefferson City, and then also a photograph of Ray posing as Eric Galt. Eric Galt's going to be a very important alias as we go forward. It's very similar to the alias that Lee Harvey Oswald allegedly, had. Remember that? He was found when he was arrested. He had two IDs on him, right? And that alias ends up being the name on the P.O. box where the gun was sent, the Malica Carcano, where the 38 special was sent. And it really became a way, that alias became a way for naval intelligence to identify him to Dallas police within 14 minutes of the shooting because they were aware of his alias. Find out later it's because they gave him that alias. So, of course, they're aware. Well, here we have a situation where an alias is, the public is alerted to the idea that this guy has an alias. We're going to find out, similar to what Lee Harvey Oswald being given an alias during his time in the Marine Corps and all his training with the CIA, naval intelligence. This guy, James Earl Ray, was also given an alias. And be interesting when we get into a look into who that really was and why that alias matters. Okay, so what I've done in this first episode, I just wanted to lay out the government case and to show you how easy it would be to convince American people that this guy was guilty. Because if it was just one thing, you could argue maybe against it, but it wasn't just one thing. It was a whole slew of things that when you put them all together, it looked like it was an open and shut case, that he had committed the murder and he even admitted to it, pled guilty, and took a sentence. In these next 5 episodes, we're going to find that if there had been an honest trial, if he'd had adequate representation, for example, and had an honest trial, that all evidence is not as it seems. I just gave you the government version. This came straight from the government report. So as it stands right now, it looks like James Earl Ray shot and killed Martin Luther King. If you just gave me that, this is why you have trials. Because when a prosecutor gets done laying out his case, if you stop then and you ask the jury for a decision, they're going to unanimously agree that he's guilty. But this is why you have a defense. Somebody, there may be another story to the side to this story. So the next 5 episodes will be the other side to this story. And I hope you'll join me as we go through this because it's a very interesting story, much more than meets the eye. What we just looked at is the easy stuff. And then when you start looking at the individual testimony of these people and the evidence itself, how it got where it was, the alias, all this stuff, paints a completely different picture. So we'll get into that in episode 2. Until then, hope everybody has a great weekend. God bless. Thank you.